Alrighty, it's the top of the hour, so we'll get started. The topic for today's webinar is how do I manage my cybersecurity management system? Before diving into the main topics for the webinar, I like to just give a little bit of background on myself and on Exida. So here is our kind of short summary of the content that we'll be reviewing today. And then what I want to highlight on this slide is that we are doing the webinar over the GoToWebinar application. And so if at any point you have questions or there's trouble with the audio, please don't hesitate to just use the questions tool. We'll have a couple of people from Exida on the webinar who can help with any of those questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we should have about 15 minutes left over to go through and answer any technical questions. A little bit of background about myself. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and I'm a safety and cybersecurity engineer with Exida. My background is in chemical engineering, but over time, as safety and cyber have been more and more related, there's kind of a natural transition where I went from doing just safety risk assessments to also considering cybersecurity. And so now I work regularly in both of those areas. Exida is a customer-focused company, and we have three main parts. The first is our enterprise tool. And so that could be Exlentia or also some of our OEM software, such as ArcX. And so really the goal for that is to have more efficient lifecycle activities and deliver technically correct results. We also have a certification and assessment division that is a world leader in functional safety and cybersecurity certifications to IACS 61508 and IACS 62443 respectively. And then lastly, we've got lifecycle services. And so really focusing on solving the toughest security, alarm management, and safety problems. And so what we look at today with the cybersecurity management system will mostly fall under that last group for the lifecycle services. When it comes to cybersecurity, there are really a lot of different things that Exida is involved with and a lot of different ways that they can help. The first is consulting services, so everything from policy and procedure development to risk assessment and vulnerability analysis. We have certifications, so we have accredited certifications for both equipment and also integrated systems. And then we have a number of training courses focused to all the different stakeholders involved in cybersecurity. We also have a large number of tools and reference material, training material that can be helpful references for cybersecurity. Our webinar today, where we really dive deep on cybersecurity management, will have three main parts. The first will be to review common findings from Exida's cybersecurity gap assessments, kind of get just a pulse of what we're seeing in industry and some of the key takeaways and what recommendations we would have coming from that. Next, we'll look at best practices for developing cybersecurity management systems and what really goes into making one of those effective. And then lastly, we'll cover the benefits of cybersecurity management systems and talk about how they can help organizations when they are implemented. But first, findings from cybersecurity gap assessments. And so when we talk about a cybersecurity gap assessment, we're really talking about assessing where an organization currently is based off of set criteria. And so when Exida does those gap assessments, we typically look at a combination of the NIST cybersecurity framework and also the IACS 62443 standards. And so we will essentially go through and talk about each of the security topics. We'll document what's currently done by the organization, and then anywhere where we see that that's not fully aligned with best practice or there are potential areas for improvement, we then make recommendations on how to improve that security capability moving forward. And so we've done dozens of these types of assessment. We've gotten to see lots of different types of plants, and there are just a couple of things that seem to be coming up, and I thought it would be helpful to kind of look at it in a webinar and see what some common ways to make headway would be. And so when we go through the common findings, I want to kind of tackle on both some of the positive things and then also some of the areas for improvement. So one of the biggest things that we've seen recently is that cybersecurity awareness is definitely increasing significantly. It's becoming a much sharper point of focus at a lot of organizations, and it's more clear that people are taking an active role in trying to address it. We're also seeing a move towards more updated, more patchable systems, kind of as Industry 4.0 continues, and there's this continued idea of connecting control environments. Organizations are realizing that to do that, they do need to upgrade and move to more modern control systems. And so while it's not uncommon to see that there are still certainly legacy systems out there, everything from Windows XP even back to Windows 96, typically for the most part, systems are being built and put together with more recent equipment. And then lastly, we are certainly starting to see that security concepts are starting to be applied and starting to take hold a little bit. So looking at things like hardening, whitelisting, periodic patching for security vulnerabilities, all of that is starting to be put into place. And so we're seeing significant improvements in the overall security. In the areas for rooms for improvement, there are also a couple common threads. The first of which is that clear documentation of cybersecurity roles and responsibilities is something that is not in place for all organizations yet. And so while there may be specific individuals who are driving cybersecurity or have a specific focus in it, it's not necessarily getting to that next phase of being clearly defined by the organization and having really a clear division of what tasks fall to what individuals. So that would be something that we would certainly recommend looking at in terms of improving cybersecurity maturity. We also a lot of times find that although the security concepts are being applied, it really comes down to the skill of the individual and their knowledge of the topic to do it correctly. And there aren't as many procedures for repeatable execution of cybersecurity activities. And so what that means is, although the tasks are being done correctly now, if for any reason the individual is driving it or to take new roles, or we're no longer able to really just spearhead cybersecurity themselves, there is no repeatable method. There's no clear definition of these are what the steps that are required for patching or for any of the other cybersecurity activities would be. And then the last area where we're seeing definitely some potential room for improvement would be communication of cybersecurity requirements to stakeholders. And this is kind of one of the ones where people don't necessarily expect it going in, but once we get there and we start talking about it, everyone's eyes kind of light up and they realize that this is really important moving forward. And so what we're talking about here in terms of communication of cybersecurity requirements to stakeholders is understanding that equipment suppliers and integrators play a critical role in how secure the system is, and that regardless of how much patching or how much monitoring you're doing on the network, if it's built by components that are already compromised or that have lots of existing vulnerabilities on day one, you're not really having a clear sense of what level of security has been achieved. And so having that clear communication and that clear definition of requirements for the stakeholders really is a huge opportunity to improve the overall cybersecurity awareness, overall cybersecurity implementation for sites. And so kind of taking those pros and cons together, we've got kind of 3 bullet points that summarize the typical current industry environment. So the first one is positive in that organizations are more prepared to handle cybersecurity incidents now due to efforts of individuals and organizations. So we're definitely see people stepping up and really trying to drive this to move their organizations to a higher security level. And so that's really positive. That's really the critical first step, is for some people to identify that this is a major issue and really start a focus on it. The drawback, though, is that the organizational implementation is being hindered by a lack of clear cybersecurity management and also a lack of coordination between the stakeholders. And what's important here is kind of to make sure twofold. One, that the cybersecurity tasks are getting completed at some point during the life cycle, so making sure that it's well understood, who's responsible for the security development of the system and who's responsible for maintaining the security of the system. And it's also important then to make sure that we're not double dipping on effort so that we can have an efficient implementation of the cybersecurity. And then the last point is that for those organizations that are going above kind of just the ad hoc approach and do have documentation, we're seeing that it's primarily focused on specific cybersecurity tasks. And there aren't many organizations who have fully established a cybersecurity management system or essentially put together the overall approach for security and how that is handled and kind of how the different procedures relate to each other. And when we get into, how do I manage my cybersecurity management system, that's really critical. If we think back to the example from the abstract, we talk about firewall rules. And so if an organization wants to assess how well their network segmentation is working, are they going to, the firewall configuration procedure? Are they going to their zone and conduit diagram to kind of assess how effective it's split up and what the procedures for that are? Or are they going to some sort of audit procedure? And so while each one of those may have, bits and pieces of how to assess the network segmentation, really having that clear definition, that understanding of this is the part that's covered by this procedure, this is what needs to be covered based on the rule configuration, and having a central document that can steer you in the right direction is really critical, and it is what we would talk about as kind of one of the main objectives of that cybersecurity management system. When we think about the cybersecurity management system, it's really critical that while it's focused on specifically the asset owner requirements, that it clearly communicates what the other stakeholder requirements are. So if we think about the original equipment manufacturers, they are the ones responsible for developing the equipment in a secure manner, so not introducing vulnerabilities either in the configurations or in the process for building the devices. They're also responsible for providing adequate security capabilities so that in the event of any sort of attack or something, that there is the adequate security protections and capabilities in place to give that resiliency. And so there are specific portions of the IACS 62443 standard that relate to both of those parts. For system integrators, now we're looking at taking those pieces that have hopefully been designed with adequate capabilities and for a secure development lifecycle process, and actually putting them together and building secure systems out of that. And so really all of that happens and is put into place before the system even goes to the asset owner or the operator. And so there's really a lot of critical steps in terms of the design and development where if that's not specified, the asset owner really doesn't have any control of how secure the system is during that time period. But once the system's provided to the asset owner, then it really is their ultimate responsibility for maintaining that security. And so any deficiencies that were introduced in terms of the equipment development process or the system integration, then they really have to live with it, and it becomes their responsibility to perform those updates and to do the necessary monitoring. So by specifying the requirements for equipment suppliers and system integrators, it can then be much easier for the asset owner to maintain and monitor the security of the control system. The last stakeholder that is important for cybersecurity, and we definitely don't want to neglect, is looking at the government and regulatory agencies. So thinking about for specific industries, for specific countries, what sort of legal regulatory requirements are there, and making sure that those get considered, not only that they're kind of driving good cybersecurity adoption, but also that the cybersecurity management system keeps those considerations well documented and can easily show how regulatory requirements are being complied with. When we look at the IACS 62443 standard, we can see that it really is split up by stakeholder and that there are very specific requirements for each stakeholder. So for product suppliers, they carry out that security development process to the IACS 62443 4-1 standard. So that really is driving the process side of it. On the capability side, that then falls under 4-2, and based on the foundational requirements, there are a list of capabilities that must be provided for security level. So once a secure configured instance of the product is available, that's really then the building blocks that system integrators would take to build a secure system. And so the process for building a secure system has specific development security requirements that are outlined in 2-4. And so the system integrators are really responsible for making sure that those requirements are followed so that the system built is of adequate security. Additionally, 3-2 outlines the risk assessment requirements. And because each configuration is unique and can have a significant impact on the overall security, a risk-based approach is recommended for identifying what the highest potential consequences are and determining for that configuration what security level is required. Then section 3-3 of the standard is really where the capabilities are assessed, and if for the overall system, it can be demonstrated that all of those foundational requirements and requirement enhancements are met, that's then where you've documented that a system has achieved a specific security level, and really that it is in a secure place to start operations. When we get to the asset owner, then their portion is really more driven on the policy and procedure side. So sections 2-1 and 2-4 really govern the activities of the asset owner and the steps that they need to take to maintain the security, maintain the integrity of the automation solution or the control system, whatever term is used. And so sometimes when we get to this slide and we're talking through it with an asset owner, they'll kind of say, oh, that's great. We just have these two parts to worry about for the operation, and we can just let the product supplier and system integrator handle it. And so what we would say is the flaw with that approach is if, on the equipment supplier level, if those security capabilities aren't in place or they're not developed between a secure lifestyle, you may not see that as the asset owner, but it means that the system you're building up doesn't really have a known security at the start, and you may not have all of the capabilities necessary to achieve a required security level. Same thing with the integrators, where they're so involved with putting the system together, but are you aware of their cybersecurity hygiene? Do they go through the same cyber awareness training that you require for all of your operators? And almost always the answer to that question is no, or, well, we're sure that they have cybersecurity requirements, we just don't know what they are. And so it's really important to not only understand the requirements for the system integrators and equipment suppliers, but also have them formally defined as your organization's requirement so that when anyone is providing a system or providing equipment, they know what the expectation is and you can audit them and demonstrate that those security capabilities, that secure process has been followed. And so really all of that and that coordination between stakeholders needs to be thought about when documenting the asset owner's approach to cybersecurity. When we look at how security systems and the development lifecycle, all of the policies and procedures are rated in IACS 62443, they use the idea of a maturity level or essentially a maturity model to assess the cybersecurity resiliency and the level of repeatability for the different tasks. And so there are 4 separate maturity levels defined. The first one is initial or ad hoc. And essentially in this one, all of the cybersecurity tasks may or may not be completed, and they may be done really, really well, but the problem is there's no formal documentation on how it's done, and so it really relies on the individuals to be driving it and to cover the necessary steps. The next maturity level above that is managed. And so this is where now policies have been written, personnel have been trained, they're competent to complete them, but you just haven't gotten into the stage of actually implementing them yet. Maturity level 3 is defined and practiced. And so now, you've got all of the requirements of the maturity level 2 system, and it's actually been put into place at least once. So it's been used, it's been tested, and then when we get to maturity level 4 for improving, it's now continuous improvement processes based on, defined cybersecurity metrics. And so that's where once you've got a system defined, once you're using it, by having these metrics, you can identify what's working well, what isn't, and continue to improve off of those policies and procedures so that the organization's cybersecurity posture is always improving. And so having those defined metrics and understanding what cybersecurity is being graded on really goes a long way in being able to assess, whether an organization is getting more secure or whether they may be getting less secure. And so having all of that in place is really what we would look at as a mature approach to cybersecurity. If we think about applying these maturity levels back to kind of what we've seen in industry, for all of those places where although security procedures or security activities are being adopted, if they're not clearly documented, if they're not well defined, then we're really looking at more of a maturity level 1 system. And so they may be doing great things for cybersecurity now, but it's not in a repeatable manner, and they're not able to really be tracking those key metrics and having that continuous improvement. So a really big opportunity to move from this initial ad hoc level to a higher maturity really comes down to defining those cybersecurity requirements and developing that cybersecurity management system. And so what we'll be talking about in the next section of the webinar is looking at the best practices for cybersecurity management systems, and so what actually goes in place for putting those systems together and how to make sure that they are successful. The first thing to really look at before diving into what the cybersecurity management system is and what it's trying to achieve is understanding why does organizing for security matter? What's the purpose of really jumping into the cybersecurity management? How does it fit in with the rest of the organization's goals? And so the first, probably most important bullet point on this slide is that without commitment from the top, security will not be achieved. And so this really is important to know that, regardless of the good intentions or how hard, a controls engineer or an IT engineer may be driving it, without managerial buy-in, without support from them, they won't really be able to get that organizational adoption. They won't be able to drive the changes that would be needed to really see that security improvement. Additionally, the organization's specific cybersecurity goals need to be communicated to stakeholders. And so having the clear requirements for the system integrators, for the equipment suppliers, and documenting what your organization is trying to achieve for security is really important for making sure that you're building the system with secure parts and that you're looking at security really throughout the full life cycle. The next important part of organizing for security is having those clearly defined roles and responsibilities, because without them, it's really difficult for an efficient execution of cybersecurity activities. And so this means, again, where you don't want to have any cybersecurity activities that are missed, and you don't want to have multiple people doing the same activity. So by defining, what falls under the purview of IT versus OT, by having clear roles for this is what the controls engineer is responsible for, this is what control supervisors should be looking at, it really helps to make sure that cybersecurity is being driven by the right people in the right areas. And that's what's so important for execution, is that consistent rollout with everyone knowing what their specific job is. And the last one, is kind of a no-brainer for cybersecurity, but is only becoming more true, is that multiple parts of the organization really need to coordinate to be successful. And so we can think about both IT and OT, how they're able to coordinate for cybersecurity. We can think about the HR requirements, the engineering requirements. And so really, not only defining those roles, but also the overall objectives is really effective and helpful in getting those different parts of the organization to work together in order to be successful. So when we think about, organizing for security, and with all of those things in mind from the previous slide, how can we do that successfully? What is the best approach? Um, there are a couple options that we've seen in the past and that seem to work well. And we'll talk through both of them and look at the pros and cons for each method. So the first approach is a cross-functional team of both IT and OT cybersecurity. So this is really one coordinated team that is responsible for everything on the IT and OT side of security. It would be led by a senior cybersecurity personnel, so whether it's the organization's CISO or chief security officer, and then they would be coordinating with both members of the IT and then the manufacturing or the engineering OT side of the network. And so it would be one coordinated team whose responsibilities covered all of that. And so the pros are, you've got one team, so you've got that clear channel of communication, and then kind of can be continually working on that. The potential, cons of this are now that for all of the OT and all of the IT security issues, you've now got some people where they maybe don't directly apply. And so sometimes you could see this leads to lots of larger meetings and maybe not the most efficient deployment. If we look at the second approach, this is now maintaining a separate ICS security team that's separate from the corporate IT security team. And so the benefits here are that each team really, is focusing in on its wheelhouse. If they have, clearly defined roles of what falls to the ICS team, what falls to the IT team, they can really work on their specific objectives and kind of focus in on what's most important for their parts of the system. What potentially is a downside here is that if you don't have clear communication between those groups, and we know that sometimes it's difficult for having that clear communication between IT and OT teams, is that you can kind of start to break down and you can either be missing things or duplicating effort. And so one of the things that we really want to emphasize is fundamental to successfully deploying approach 2 is having that clear line of communication, making sure that the head of the ICS security team and the head of the IT team are clearly aware of the roles and responsibilities of their different teams, and that they have clear communication, so when things pop up that are in a bit of a gray area, that they can both look at it and work together on a solution. So with both of those options in mind, it's then good to kind of take a look and think about, when we're talking about security documents, what are the different types of scopes? What are the different things that we could be looking at in terms of, pulling these policies and procedures together? So on our top end, our broadest scope would be what we call a policy. So we can think of this like the Cybersecurity Management System. It's really an expression of intent. It's guidance for senior management and the organization as a whole to document, the ownership of specific tasks, what the responsibilities are, and then the overall objectives for how security is achieved. For standards, we're now kind of documenting a requirement for compliance or a particular means of implementing or executing a security function that comes out of the security policy. So now we're getting more into the methods and mechanisms that will enforce the policy. And then lastly, our most narrow scope is a procedure. And so this is a description of specific steps that must be followed to carry out responsibilities defined in a security policy or standard. So moving at our policy from the broadest to then the narrowest scope. When we think about that then with the Cybersecurity Management System as our overarching document, we really want to look at first what the scope of that covers. So it's really the formal definition of cybersecurity strategy, the organizational goals, the process for achieving security, and also then the timing for the cybersecurity management system and for the subsequent procedures and lifecycle activities that they cover. So really defining when risk assessment's done, what falls to the different suppliers, looking at all of the stakeholders and clearly communicating those expectations is really a fundamental part of the management system. And so although it may not directly fall to the asset owner's requirements, the cybersecurity management system should reference what requirements the contractors and integrators are being held to. A key thing that we want to note about the cybersecurity management system is that it outlines what you want to achieve for cybersecurity, not how to do it. The specific standards and procedures referenced by the CSMS are really where you get that specific step-by-step approach and all of the activities or all of the requirements that go into completing an activity. In addition, when keeping the bullet points above in mind when building the cybersecurity management system, it's also important to remember that the overall requirements for the asset owner are what are defined in 2-1. So including those 9 security program elements and documenting how the organization approaches each of them is a very important part of the lifecycle management. When we kind of look at an overall view or a graphic of what's included by the cybersecurity management system, the first parts are really what we covered on the last slide. So defining the specific scope of the cybersecurity management system and also the organizational security approach. So this is where, whether the organization moves towards a single consolidated team or towards a more of a split approach where there's a specific IACS security team and a specific IT security team. That needs to be clearly defined as part of the cybersecurity management system. And so when they're working with a combined team, typically both the IT and OT considerations will be considered in one management system. If 2 separate teams are maintained, then more often or not, you would see a cybersecurity specific management system for OT and then an IT version of cybersecurity management. But these would need to relate to each other and be clearly aligned. So it's an important activity to go through for both sides. The other part that's really critical and kind of is the meat of the CSMS is documenting the organization's approach to the 9 security program elements from section 2-1, and then also the specific cybersecurity lifecycle tasks that are completed and the tools and templates that are used for completing those lifecycle tasks. In addition to that, an effective CSMS also has a big emphasis on staff training and awareness. So making sure that all members of the organization are aware of their cybersecurity responsibilities and that they're trained and knowledgeable in those responsibilities. Another really important step in terms of the effectiveness of the program is to define a business continuity plan. So in the event of a cybersecurity incident, what's the emergency response? What's done to isolate the intrusion? What's done to mitigate the consequences? And then how does the organization recover over time? How do you assess how long operations can continue or how long the business can continue to function until the incident has been resolved? So all of that, really fits in as part of this cybersecurity management system. And then if we think of the last part for how do we, continually improve the cybersecurity management system, it comes down to, formal compliance audits. So documenting what the time period for the audits is, documenting who's responsible for those audits and what type of material will be reviewed. And then looking at the process of taking that feedback, taking the results from those audits and using that to continually improve and maintain the cybersecurity management system. If we kind of take then all of those parts and pieces that make up the cybersecurity management system, it's a reasonable question to ask, well, what really goes into making a cybersecurity management system successful? So as we talked about before, management buy-in, so getting support from the top, having a clear understanding of what the organization is trying to achieve for cybersecurity is critically important for successful adoption. And part of that, we can also think about how do we then integrate cybersecurity management with existing risk management systems? So thinking about an organization's approach to functional safety and looking at those tolerable risk criteria and the risk matrices. So really an effective cybersecurity management system will show how security is an important part of safety and how it does have an impact on the overall risk register for the organization. And so by doing that and really aligning with those existing procedures, you can get a lot more backing, a lot more support within the organization, and also have a more clear way to compare cybersecurity concerns with other safety concerns that are currently being addressed. Next, the emphasis on personnel security in the CSMS is huge. So not only doubling down on awareness, but also the specific competency requirements, what level of personnel certification is required for different individuals with different levels of involvement with security, what sort of screening is done for new employees, and what sort of practices does HR in place have to identify if there are any major changes for existing staff and see if that is going to have an impact on the overall security achieved. And so awareness, we talked about earlier, is something that's definitely improving, but it's something that really can't be left behind. And there always needs to be that, continual refresher and that continual emphasis on awareness. One good example of this from some recent studies is looking at phishing campaigns. That's something that, certainly there's been a heightened increase in awareness on. Lots of IT departments are really pushing that, but we're seeing that the number of phishing campaigns, number of phishing attacks continues to improve, and that with sophisticated spear phishing campaigns and things like that, where they're really, targeting. Having that continued awareness is, very important, and just sending that out there is an important reminder to really not fall for those types of attacks. In addition to the emphasis on personnel security, the employer training programs are also really important in terms of how do the employees actually go through the steps of gaining that competency, what sort of refresher awareness training are they going through, and so aligning those training programs with the emphasis on personnel security is really important. And then the last bullet we want to talk about in terms of what leads to a successful CSMS is leverage effective tools and build upon templates. So if we think about it, everything from security monitoring to vulnerability assessment and risk assessment really can be much more effective if it's done with a consistent tool, if there's a clear understanding of the organization of how that tool is used. So looking at how you can build tools into the cybersecurity management system is definitely one way to improve the effectiveness and improve the repeatability of the tasks that are completed. Additionally, if we think about templates, for all of those procedures and policies that are already in place, there's really no reason to start from scratch to try to reinvent the wheel. Really building upon the existing progress in cybersecurity and now starting to pull it together is one way to be effective. In addition to this, you can also look for templates that document all of the standards requirements. And so it already kind of has built that in, and that gives you a consistent starting point to work from. And so, for example, at exida, we have developed cybersecurity management system templates that can be purchased that essentially walk through all of the requirements of 2-1 and demonstrate how that can be coordinated with other specific policies and procedures to achieve cybersecurity goals. So that really takes us through what are the steps of building an effective cybersecurity management system. Now let's quickly walk through what are the benefits of that. So the biggest and most direct benefit is that putting a cybersecurity management system in place is really the number one most important step to move an organization from an ad hoc maturity level all the way to that improving maturity level. Initially, it will kind of jump you up to that manage because you will have the written policies and procedures, but very quickly, as soon as it's put into place, it'll be defined and practiced. And then with that audit portion, with that continuous improvement portion, you really want to bake in that maturity level 4 right into the cybersecurity management system. And so by putting the documentation in place, it really jumpstarts and moves to a reproducible, repeatable process for achieving security, and just helps improve the overall organizational maturity regarding cybersecurity. If we think of some of the other key outcomes for the management systems, one would be improved communications with vendors regarding cybersecurity requirements. This one is hugely important and can be really beneficial if for each project, each upgrade, if you've got a clear set of cybersecurity requirements and you can provide them to the vendor and simply ask, how are these requirements being met? What are the security practices being followed? That'll really lead to clear communication with stakeholders and can help build um, a more secure system. Also, as we talked about in terms of increasing the maturity level, but building that repeatable and continually improving cybersecurity practice for all of the different lifecycle activities is fundamentally important, and that's really how you are able to assess if security is improving and make sure that the necessary steps are being taken to achieve security goals. Next, we talked a little bit about aligning cybersecurity with existing organizational risk activities. And so looking at that and understanding how that plays a role really then helps to deploy the correct level of cybersecurity solution for the application. If you identify something that is a really high cybersecurity risk, then that's the justification for putting in extra countermeasures in place, for doing that extra level of rigor. But if you look at something that really has a limited consequence and you're able to document and show why, then there may be a lower level of security that will be adequate protection from the relevant types of attacks. So really looking at a risk-based approach helps you custom fit the solution for your needs. Another key takeaway is that with the cybersecurity management in place, you can certainly see improved efficiency in completing cybersecurity tasks. Not only are there clearly defined roles who are responsible for it, but there is clear guidance on what procedure to go to that really helps with the what and how of actually completing those tasks. So having that CSMS in place really leads to significant improvements there. And then lastly, what we can talk about is for larger multi-site organizations, even multinational organizations, it's not uncommon to see kind of wildly different levels of cybersecurity readiness at different sites. And so when that cybersecurity management system is deployed, it really gives you the ability to deploy that single approach globally and now hold all sites to the same standard. And so we've worked on some larger, really global development projects for trying to improve organization cybersecurity and getting the CSMS defined, having that one standard that all of the sites would be judged against was a really important part of that journey. And it's certainly something that for any larger organizations trying to understand how to deploy cybersecurity for multiple sites, it really does all boil down to having that effective cybersecurity management system. So in summary, what we walked through in today's webinar was we really focused on how to effectively manage cybersecurity and cybersecurity management systems. So we started by talking about common findings from gap assessments that exida has completed. We looked at what are the best practices for building that cybersecurity management system. And then we looked at what the benefits of that system are for the asset owner and how it can help improve security throughout the life cycle. What we want to highlight here for exida Academy are that we've got a number of upcoming courses. So we have CS 102 courses that will be offered in Houston, Boston, San Francisco, and Sellersville upcoming. And if you don't see any that are near you but are interested, don't hesitate to reach out and ask for the upcoming training dates. And so when we look at the CS 102 course or the IACS 62443 Lifecycle course, that's one that really would dive deeper on this topic for asset owners and look at all of the cybersecurity lifecycle tasks. For our CS 201 course, this is specifically targeted for cybersecurity software development, so looking at original equipment manufacturers. And then lastly, our CS 204 course is for our integrators and solution providers. And this is really then focused on the requirements for designing and putting together secure systems. If none of the dates outlined on the previous slide work well, we do also have online self-paced training that is very helpful and can kind of cover a lot of the same topics. And so we're happy to announce that the CS 102 course is now online. So if there is any interest in taking that course and the course dates don't work well, the online training is a great option for that. As always, if you're interested in learning more about Exida, please don't hesitate to follow us on all of the latest social media to get updates for other upcoming webinars or even in-person seminars and different training courses like that. And so now we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if you had a question throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to put that in now. I know I did see a few that came up during the presentation. All right, so right now I've got, it looks like about 3 to answer, so I'll go through those. And then at the end of that, if there aren't any additional questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. My email is on the screen. And so I'm always happy to answer those questions if you don't ask them during the session. So the first question that I'm seeing coming up is, how common is it to have a specific OT cybersecurity management system versus a CSMS that would cover both IT and OT? So what I would say is that we've definitely seen both approaches adopted in industry, and it really comes down to how the organization chooses to arrange the cybersecurity team. When you've got that cross-functional team, more often than not, we see one central cybersecurity management system. And if you go with the ICS specific team, that's when then we see the two different cybersecurity management systems. And so, even if they are different, it is really important that they are aligned together and that you've got kind of clear metrics that you're tracking for both of them. Okay. The next question then is, how does functional safety management from IACS 61508, how does that relate back to cybersecurity management in IACS 62443? And so what I would say for that one is that there are definitely clear parallels, and the cybersecurity standards have definitely pulled a lot from what was successful in IACS 61508 and try to balance some of those management activities off of that. So those would be the main similarities kind of in the overall structure and the kind of performance-based nature of the cybersecurity management system. The main differences would be looking at the specific lifecycle tasks that are covered. So for example, why risk assessment may appear in both safety and cyber, looking at things like the network segmentation or patch management and some of the different things that are done to monitor for security. That's where they really start to belong more in that specific cybersecurity management system. Okay, and so then the last question that I'm seeing now is, for equipment manufacturers, is there an equivalent to a cybersecurity management system, or basically how would that relate to their requirements? And so the answer to that one is yes, absolutely. So instead of being governed by 2-1, that's specifically looked at in section 4-1 of the standard, and it's basically looking at the secure development lifecycle and the specific development procedures and practices that have to be put in place. So following very similar concepts to the asset owner CSMS, you would want to implement a similar type approach, just with the specific requirements for developing and testing secure equipment. All right, so that is the last question that I saw come in. Thank you everyone very much for your time on the webinar this afternoon, and please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Take care.